when it comes to prompt engineering and prompt design, the burden shouldn't be on an admin or an architect to become, super expert in all things linguistics and prompt engineering and prompt design. And so part of how we're trying to sort of take that onus upon the platform is we have a set of out-of-the-box prompts that we'll ship with Einstein GPT.
Today, I'm here with Greg Bennett, who's Director of Conversation Design at Salesforce. We are going to be talking about a very hot topic, which is Einstein GPT, but also more generally, this concept of GPT and large language models. And so why don't we start there? What is one of the most misunderstood parts of generative AI?
Across the industry and even just in public discourse, one of the things that I see sort of as a common maybe misrepresentation of these large language models is that they can actually think, or that there's actual cognition there. The thing I like to sort of liken GPT and large language models to is a calculator. So you know how like in school you can you start out learning math by hand, you do your times tables, all that stuff, but then eventually you end up in more advanced math classes like algebra or calculus, and you have to use a calculator.
Right.
Now the calculator can't think for you, but it can help you crunch certain numbers and make your sort of math solving process a little bit faster. That's how I think about GPT and large language models. They're like word calculators. They can help you jumpstart your process and give you that sort of jumping off point, but it's not going to be able to truly think for you. And I think when I hear terms like hallucinations and whatnot sort of floating around the internet, it implies that there's cognition there. Only humans really kind of hallucinate, and humans have cognition. But truthfully, it's not a hallucination that the large language model is having. It's literally just making something up.
Right.
It is based on its prediction, according to what mathematically, statistically most likely to come next in a sentence. This is what would be put in there. And whether or not that's factually accurate may or may not be the case.
I've heard you talk about sort of like the time frame of data that's
Mhm.
being fed to like
Yes.
Chat GPT. Maybe we can chat about that.
Yeah, so it's going to depend on whatever provider of the large language model you're using. So, OpenAI is a provider, Cohere, Anthropic are also providers. Salesforce is also creating their own homegrown large language models. And so really depending on the provider, it's going to be important for you to kind of check, what data sources are these things trained on? With OpenAI, we know that it's trained on the whole internet. But for ChatGPT, which is also known as GPT 3.5 Turbo, that's the name of the model that's behind ChatGPT,
Okay.
that data is trained up until 2021. Or actually, rather 2020, and that GPT-4 is trained up until 2021. And so if you were going to ask either one of those models, who's the prime minister of the United Kingdom, you're going to get a different answer because it's trained to a
Interesting.
different period of time, and it may not necessarily be exactly who the prime minister is today.
Got it.
So that gets back to a little bit around that accuracy issue. Like there
Mhm.
was one time where I had asked ChatGPT to suggest like the top 10 running trails in the Bay Area. And I'm based out of the Bay Area. I'm not a runner, so I don't know any of these things. I checked the output that I got from the model, and it suggested a trail that is not open to the public.
Oh,
So stuff like that, where it's like, okay, yes, technically it is a trail, and I'm sure the views are great, but none of us can use it because it's not
right.
open to the public.
Minor detail. Yes, that's important.
Exactly.
And I've heard you use these two words, I don't know, interchangeably. So I want to clarify. We
Sure.
use like large language model, GPT? Can we use those interchangeably? Or if not, what's the difference?
So GPT is a type of large language model.
Okay.
It is the large language model that is offered by OpenAI, and so they kind of have the sort of branding around it. But
Yes.
large language model sort of refers to that umbrella of here is a model that is trained on a vast data source that proactively, predictively creates, essentially language.
Got it. Got it. So how did you get into all of this? How did you become the director of conversation design at Salesforce?
Yeah, I mean, my academic background is in linguistics, so I studied very particularly what's called interactional sociolinguistics, which is a big fancy
Okay,
term for how do people talk in everyday situations, how do they
got it.
use language in everyday situations, and so that's really the foundation of how I not only look at the world but really approach this work. And I started my career at Microsoft working on Cortana. That was sort of my initial foray into UX and conversation design. And then I moved to Salesforce, worked in research for a while. And then several years ago, when we started working on bots and voice, that's when I was moonlighting as a conversation designer. And eventually we reached sort of a fever pitch. And it was like,
Hmm.
okay, let's do jobs.
Right, right.
And I switched over full time into conversation design, founded and established the practice in 2019. In 2020, we acquired Slack. And so then I started
Right.
growing a team because everyone was creating Slack apps.
Yep.
And now my team focuses very much on the prompt engineering or prompt design aspect of
Got
large
it.
language models. So whenever you're gonna, particularly for enterprise use cases, this is really key because whenever you're going to ask a large language model to create some kind of content, we have to give it some sort of context, particularly for business to business use cases, for example, we are going to maybe ask the model, let's say in this case GPT, to create a piece of content that is going to be sent on behalf of another person to maybe a customer.
Right.
But GPT needs to be able to understand that kind of relationship. Part of what we learn in interactional sociolinguistics is that depending on the distance or the closeness between you and the other person you're talking to, the way that you communicate might be a little different. And the thing that you're talking about, your relationship to that thing that you're talking about, and the person you're talking to and their relationship to that thing that y'all are talking
Right.
about, it's all going to change the way you communicate. And so we need to be able to sort of set the scene for
Got it.
GPT. I kind of think of it as like, I've never done any theater, but my understanding of acting in theater are things like you give stage directions, you kind of give context about how do these characters know each other. We have to do
Right.
something very similar.
Interesting.
The conversation designers on my team, they used to be the ones who would create the actual language that a bot would send in chat. Hello,
Oh.
howdy, how are you doing? That kind of
Hmm.
stuff.
Hmm.
Now that's sort of where it gets shifted over to GPT or any other large language model. And we get to lean more deeply into our interaction design, saying how should the interaction work overall based on what we know about human behavior and norms of conversation.
Hmm.
Um, who are the participants? How do they know each other? How are they orienting to this thing that we're creating using GPT? And then tell that to GPT.
Right.
So that way
Okay.
it doesn't accidentally write an email that the customer would send to the salesperson instead of the other way
The other
around.
way around. Right. Right. Interesting. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So with Einstein GPT in particular, I know a lot of architects who might be watching this, right, have seen the sort of the marketing, maybe seen the sizzle reel, and I know that there's obviously a lot going on behind this. What are some of those architectural considerations at a high level that go into building a product like Einstein GPT?
Yeah. Particularly for Salesforce, and this is actually one of the most exciting things I've ever worked on. So we know, for those of us who work on Salesforce, we know that if it lives on a record in an object, that you can call that information, you can summon it anywhere. We also know for anyone who works in conversational AI with large language models that we have to give it context. A lot of folks refer to this as grounding. So if you ever hear, does the prompt that you're using have grounding? It really means like, are we giving it the full context in order to be able to interpret the instructions? The way that we kind of conceive of it is if those pieces of information live as fields on a record in Salesforce, we can call that information to contextualize the prompt that we send to
Hmm.
GPT or whatever large language model. That could be anything from a chat transcript to actual email contents, because those also get saved in fields on
Right.
Salesforce. It could be a username, it could be a contact name, all of these things. I think that's the strongest power of Einstein GPT is that it sits on top of Salesforce and leverages the power of your CRM to truly be able to scale and create this kind of personalized content for what you're trying to do. A couple of other considerations we think of on the architectural side are things like how the data itself is managed.
Mm.
So we think very carefully about compliance for things like GDPR or CCPA. If, for example, there's a specific piece of data that you may want to be able to isolate and say, okay, we either do or do not want to use this field of data in our prompts to a model, that's going to be something that each customer should have that affordance and make that decision for themselves.
Right.
An additional aspect of that is also thinking through things like toxicity and bias. So each of the providers that we work with, whether that's OpenAI, Cohere, or Anthropic, each one of them have their own sort of content moderation service. I know OpenAI has an API. For content moderation. And so that's something that we leverage as well as our own sort of internal baseline threshold. What do we consider to be quality? What do we consider to be safe? And I think one of the most exciting things about working on this project that I've seen is that our Office of Ethical and Humane Use is at the front and center of doing this work, where we're truly thinking through, okay, where are the opportunities for bias? How can a model potentially generate something like this? And how can we constrain that?
We're not just like taking the things that you're giving us and then handing it over to Chat GPT or to, there's like lots that's going on. So it's really, really interesting. And I would think that, you know, I mean, we're a little biased, I guess, ourselves, but Salesforce having such strong company values, I think is bodes well for folks who are like, want to use this technology, want to leverage AI, but maybe don't want to like build their own, roll their own, or just trust any third-party provider.
Right. And I think the way that I sort of think about it from a design perspective is, you know, 5-6 years ago when we were working on bots and creating the Einstein bot builder, the question was, okay, all right, we're going to hand this blank canvas over to customers and they can create their own bots. And my immediate thought at the time was, okay, now you're asking every admin or developer to learn how to become a conversation designer. That seemed very fair. How can we create maybe some templates? And so now we have a template ecosystem inside of the bot builder that you can start from. I think very similarly when it comes to prompt engineering and prompt design, the burden shouldn't be on an admin or an architect to become, you know, super expert in all things linguistics and prompt engineering and prompt design. And so part of how we're trying to sort of take that onus upon the platform is we have a set of out-of-the-box prompts that we'll ship with Einstein GPT that end users like salespeople or service agents will be able to invoke on their own without an admin having to do all of that themselves. And then, of course, in true Salesforce fashion, if you want to customize things and create your own custom prompts, you'll have the ability to do that too, but with guidelines and guardrails to make sure that we're, you know, giving you the kind of optimized experience for the most optimal prompt for the most optimal output.
That makes sense. And so I love that we already talked on compliance. Obviously, we want to make sure that we know what data is being, sent through the APIs to these other services. But when there's data that's generated by the AI, comes back, gets saved, that's potentially things that we need to think about being compliant with as well, right?
Yes. And so the way that we're thinking about it in the architecture really depends on when we're doing this sort of contextualizing. So for example, if you want to maybe restrict certain items or data values from being part of the model output generation process, there will be ways for you to kind of specify how you're managing your data in the experience. In terms of the content coming back from the model, we do rely, like I said, on the content moderation API from OpenAI, as well as the content moderation services that are available with Anthropic and Cohere. We're developing content moderation services for our own internal Salesforce large language models. So all of that really will be sort of baked into the sending and retrieval process, if you will.
Got it. Yep. And then what's the advantage of, so I know we're leveraging like multiple models. We're working on our own. What is the advantage of using not just like one model, or not using only one that exists already?
Each large language model and each provider is capable of a lot of things, but some of them are maybe like a bazooka when you really only need a fly swatter. You know what I mean? And so depending on the use case that you're using, you may want to swap out for a different model for different affordances. Or for example, like at Salesforce, if you want to have certain customized experiences. For example, you may want to be able to leverage a Salesforce model in that regard as well. So it's really being able to leverage the best of each service.
Got it.
To again sort of weigh that against your cost to serve and your bottom line.
That makes sense. And I would assume too, it's a little bit of a shift, but thinking about geographic concerns. So
Yes.
a lot of this was engineered. And again, I'm assuming this is in the US. What are globalization and maybe localization concerns that arise?
So the biggest global or rather localization concern is, so for example, my team is in charge of the prompt store and creating the prompts that live there for your out-of-the-box experience of Einstein GPT. Those prompts live in the backend inside of the code for Salesforce, and that doesn't get localized. The code is the code. We only localize the front end. And that was a very sort of glaring point for us in the beginning of our design journey. And I want to give a huge shout out to Denise Martinez on my team. She's one of the designers on my team and started to solve this issue herself. She's absolutely brilliant, excellent designer, where we started actually experimenting around with, even if the prompt language itself is English, but we set the target language as a language that's not English, can we still get a model output in that target language? And the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
So we're thinking through an architectural design for the way that the prompts are housed inside of the platform. So that way essentially the command or the goal or the context of what you're trying to do, like generate an email to introduce me to a new contact as their salesperson. If that part stays the same, but we switch out the different languages,
got it,
then we get that sort of localized scale.
What are some examples of things that you don't think would be best suited for a large language model?
It's really great for jumpstarting the creation process and quickly creating variations of content, or even transforming a piece of content from one format to another. So you could say, hey, I've got this list of leads and I want you to turn it into a pop song in the voice of Ariana Grande. What these large language models, and particularly, at least I can speak more specifically about GPT, the things that it's maybe not as beneficial for are things like searching for highly specific non-public information, being brief. So GPT has a bit of a length problem in terms
right.
of
I've
generating
noticed
content.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we work really hard on the prompt design team to be able to try and constrain that, especially for certain use cases. So for example, you may be able to be a bit longer in, say, an email channel response. But if you're responding over chat, like for example, our Service Cloud Einstein reply recommendations product, that's, a lot of times that happens over chat. And so you may not be able to send paragraphs. Maybe we need bullets. Maybe we need very, very short phrases as opposed to whole exposition. The other one is also exhibiting factual accuracy. So back to what I mentioned about that trail that's not open to the public, for example. Yes, factually it's a trail. Is it accurate because I'm asking for the best trails to run on? No, because I can't run on it. So those are the things that it's maybe less well suited for.
Got it. So it's definitely going to help us. It's going to help us do that cognitive work, maybe like quicker or in a different way, but it's not I know maybe not this audience, but a lot of people are like, is it going to take my job? Is it going to replace me? But there's lots of things that it's not.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that was actually one of the first questions I got, in running a conversation design team at Salesforce. As soon as GPT sort of became the hotness in December, people were asking me, "Oh my God, are you worried about your job?" And I was like, "No," because it can generate language, but can it do the interaction design? Not really. We have to tell it how to create an interaction, who all is involved, how they orient one another, what is the goal of what it is that we're trying to do, and then it will create the language. And so I think if developers even or designers are concerned, having seen what GPT-4 can do, I also agree. I think it's more of a force multiplier than anything. It allows you to be able to check your work. It allows you to be able to not have to start from scratch. And that's, I think, what is the most exciting thing about the technology.
That's awesome. And final question, what is the thing you're most excited about when it comes to Salesforce specific sort of Einstein GPT products?
The work that my team and I are doing for Einstein GPT at Salesforce is the work that I'm probably the proudest of in my last 7 years at the company, because it's such a deep interaction and collaboration with engineering in a way that I don't feel like we've been able to necessarily do before, where it literally feels like we're side by side crafting this experience at the same time. And I just love that. I like that we're able to both see how the architecture is moving, influence the shape of it, and how reflexively engineering is able to help us then shape the final output in the design and the interaction. So it feels like this very, very seamless connection. So selfishly, just sort of personally, as a Salesforce employee, that's what I'm the most excited about. For our customers, for our architects, for our developers, the thing I'm the most excited about is, again, that force multiplier. So having them be able to move faster, being able to scale, especially in the current macroeconomic climate where many organizations are experiencing headwinds and there's a need to potentially do more with less.
Yeah.
That's really where I'm excited for this technology to help our architects, in that they can, maybe it alleviates a little bit of that burden where they can scale a little bit more than they otherwise would have been able to had they not had Einstein GPT.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure. And
likewise.
Yeah, hopefully we'll hear more from you as this product evolves. Would love to have you back. And with that, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.